David Moyes, one of the Premier League's most experienced managers who's seen success with Everton and even brought European silverware to West Ham, failed. Unai Emery, a serial winner in European competitions with good league pedigree to boot, failed. Replacing a long-standing manager has so often been described as the impossible task. So the question is, how do you replace a legendary manager? If your name is Arne Slot, the answer is pretty easily. And this is the tactical blueprint that led to the Reds conquering the Premier League. Great tactics aren't always about reinvention. Sometimes they're about recognizing what deserves to survive. Klopp's Liverpool was incredibly successful, so ripping apart his entire tactical underpinnings in order to declare it the Slot era would have been nothing more than an exercise in ego from the Dutchman. In fact, it was excellent planning from the board in picking a manager that shares so many common threads with Jurgen Klopp. This meant that when Slot came into the club, it signaled it was a time for evolution rather than revolution. The first notable evolution under Slot was the tactical framework. While Klopp relied exclusively on the 4-3-3 throughout his final season, Slot deployed primarily a 4-2-3-1, a very subtle tweak, as in-game, his side could still shift to a 4-3-3 when required, with a pivot pushing high and the flexible attacking midfielder dropping in as well. There have been some personnel changes. Conor Bradley replaced Alexander-Arnold on more occasions than last season. Cody Gakpo was preferred over Darwin Núñez, and at times injuries forced Kelleher to deputise for Alisson. But the core of the team remained largely intact, with this being the most used 11. But the most significant change was Ryan Gravenberch stepping into the pivot role, seamlessly taking over and being an upgrade over Endo. Like any elite side, Liverpool have always dominated possession. But under Klopp, it always felt like high possession was a consequence of the opposition fearing the weapons at the Reds' disposal, rather than Liverpool being a possession-oriented team. This showed more often in matches against other top teams, where Liverpool could fall back to their gegenpressing routes and win the ball high up to launch quick counters. Was it thrilling? Absolutely. Occasionally chaotic? Definitely. Hyper-effective? Most certainly. But Slot wondered if he could add a touch more control. The new man made the Reds much more intentionally possession-oriented, particularly when building up from the back. The goalkeeper became a key positional responsibility when facing high-pressing teams, being the functional third man that looked to create the overload in the first phase. But even in open play, the expectation to be slightly safer with the ball was still present within the 4-2-3-1. While Liverpool were still quite vertical, there was a greater emphasis on using the midfield to express that verticality through structured play through the lines. Under Klopp, the search for verticality could, at its best, lead to exhilarating football, with the ball rapidly moving from a harmless position to bearing down on goal in an instant. But at its worst, it could become frantic, with the Reds turning over possession needlessly and frequently. Again, Slot has not ripped out the roots of the team. Verticality is still incredibly important to the side, but rather than bypassing the midfield, the ball goes through the midfield, with the long passes per game for both Konaté and Dijk falling. Though make no mistake, both can still launch the big switch when it's required. But in controlled possession, the Liverpool formation shifts. The most shocking transformation under Slot has been Ryan Gravenberch. The Dutchman has long been considered a talented prospect, but was either seen as a box-to-box number 8 in a 4-3-3 or the more offensive midfielder in a 4-2-3-1 double pivot. But few would have foreseen him becoming the linchpin as a single pivot for an elite side like Liverpool. Slot saw something in him that many others missed, and where in Klopp's final season, he only made a single appearance in the deeper role, all his performances this season came there. And here he excelled, keeping things simple with his passing, not having a particularly high volume or being particularly adventurous compared to his contemporaries. But he was able to withstand any pressure in these crucial zones with simple one-touch passing to get around the press. Where he has always stood out though is his ability to carry the ball at his feet and take on his man during his more offensive days. He still kept shades of this when he was able to get turned and with a couple of touches breeze past his man and get Liverpool up the pitch. But the reality was Gravenberch was now playing a more withdrawn role, so it wouldn't have made sense for him to take as many risks in possession as he used to, especially under pressure. This evolution mirrors what we've seen from other successful reinventions of attacking or box-to-box midfielders to more defensive roles, like Fernandinho at City, Dembele at Spurs, Kroos at Madrid, and the list goes on. Well, what of the second pivot? Whenever possible, Slot would actually not rather have his secondary pivot alongside Gravenberch, and instead he preferred that man to be patrolling between the lines alongside the number 10 to allow another progressive option for that verticality. McAllister's pivot experience was a secret weapon here though. When he did drop deep, He shapeshifted from attacking midfielder to midfield maestro in the blink of an eye. The Argentine and Gravenberch performed this midfield tango masterfully, sometimes rotating completely, other times staggering like chess pieces to create passing angles, or sitting completely alongside each other. And what about Robertson? Remember the flying Scotsman who would bomb forward relentlessly in Klopp's early years? Well, he's continued the tactical metamorphosis that started under the German, now often lurking deeper and being a little more conservative, helping to initiate plays and recycle possession rather than getting on the end of the play. And this new positioning had beneficial knock-on effects, as when he dropped deep, opposition wingers would get sucked out of position like moths to a flame, unwittingly creating these massive spaces between the lines that McAllister exploits with surgical precision. Or, if he can't get the ball there is still the potential isolation created for the tricky left winger. But the real tactical intrigue lies on the other flank. Despite injury setbacks and those swirling contract rumours, Alexander-Arnold was still Slot's go-to right-back throughout the season, ending it with more starts than Bradley. Much like Robertson, it was a continued progression of what we saw during the late-stage Klopp era. More than ever, we saw Trent abandon the traditional fullback positioning to invert into midfield territories early in build-up phases. He essentially became a hybrid right-back midfield playmaker, sometimes operating ahead of Gravenberch, other times alongside him. This is partly facilitated by the fact that Liverpool now generally have more men higher up the pitch, forcing the opposition midfield to drop deeper and deeper. And now, Liverpool's best passer is in the position to have more time and space for those raking quarterback-style passes that make him so unique. Of all the Liverpool midfielders, he is the man entrusted to play the risky passes that break open the game. But flexibility is key for Slot, so this orientation isn't always fixed, because if the Reds have spotted a different chink in the opposition's armour, Salah might be cutting inside earlier to get close to goal. And in these scenarios, Trent seamlessly reverted to more traditional width-providing duties. It's tactical flexibility at its most beautiful. But here's the thing. When Trent did invert, it allowed Slot's favourite ploy to take shape. One of the reasons he opts for a 4-2-3-1 is the natural 10 hunting for the ball between the lines. Pushing Trent in also allows McAllister to certainly join the chaos between the lines. And this has been taken to the next level by the fluidity of the front line. The key comes from the men up top and on the left, and it was usually two of Jota, Gakpo and Luis Díaz. The most important part is all three were remarkably fluid, not only happy to interchange throughout the 90, but crucially whoever was up top was always willing to drop into the midfield, more often than Núñez did, for example, when he started as a forward in Klopp's latter years. And that forward dropping in, well, they can provide a progressive option, particularly when McAllister is deeper in the build-up. Or, even when the Argentine was high, the forward is still comfortable dropping deeper to create a complete overload between the lines, or running in behind to push the defenders back and instead grow the space between the lines. All of this meant that Liverpool usually had closer connections in the central midfield, allowing a more pass-oriented attack through the middle of the pitch, due to having so many men there. In contrast to the late Klopp era, where primarily Curtis Jones was often the only man looking to occupy this region between the lines. So now, the Reds were comfortable attacking through the centre, and more importantly, being extremely vertical through the centre, due to the sheer occupation of the central zones. But make no mistake, the talisman was still very much on the right wing, as Salah continued to do what Salah does. The Egyptian tended to hug the width on the touchline in earlier phases, not beginning as centrally as we saw him do in some of the middle phases of his career. But a key role for Salah was still to constantly threaten in behind. The function of these runs in behind was to push the opposing line deeper on the pitch and create more room between the lines as well. But Salah, the model pro, has kept himself in immaculate shape, so when the opportunity did present itself to actually use his pace, he was still more than explosive enough to get away from most defenders in the league. But we discussed the close central connections earlier, and Salah is still very much a part of this. And he's aided by Szoboszlai, particularly when Trent is narrow. The Hungarian has the pace and the athleticism, and recognizes when he should be staying between the lines, crashing into the box, or when he should be making runs outside of Salah whenever the Egyptian cut in, ensuring that Salah always had runners ahead of him, helping to facilitate his greatness. This was paired with ensuring the box was always well occupied, so when the ball did go wide, the Reds had plenty of numbers to hit. But this was just the start of Slot's tactical philosophy. The defense was where the biggest departure from the Klopp era emerged, and we'll touch on that now. But Slot is always aware of the danger that the opponent poses. Their attacking shape never completely sacrificed their defensive structure, not even close. Liverpool were one of the best sides at preventing counterattacks, and a big part of that is that they always had a good rest defense. It mutated. If Robertson played deep, it could look like a lopsided 3-2 with Trent inverting. It could also be a 2-3 if Robertson was higher, or even just a 2-2 at times, with either Trent or McAllister alongside Gravenberch. Regardless of the exact configuration, a marquee aim for Slot was to ensure that the defense was well taken care of before they attacked. This addressed one of the occasional vulnerabilities under Klopp, getting caught on the counter when the initial press was broken. But what drew the most attention in the defensive phase was the press, which was perhaps the most significant departure from the Klopp era. Klopp, for the most part in his tenure, maintained the 4-3-3 in his pressing stance, which gave the Reds options. If the wingers were pressing in advance of the 9, it could allow the Reds to create a central pressing trap. Or, if they let the 9 press the centre-backs, they can instead slowly force the opposition into wide areas. Slot has altered this, and the presence of the number 10 is key. Szoboszlai looked to spring forward from the 10 position to join the centre forward, so that Liverpool were always in a 4-2-4, once again giving them options, but different kinds. It could either be a direct press when Liverpool truly wanted to suffocate their opponent, with none of the backline getting any time on the ball as the Reds went man-to-man. But the true aim of the 4-2-4 was to protect the centre of the pitch. Counterintuitively, having one less man in the midfield actually helped protect it. The front four remained relatively narrow, reducing the space between each of the pressing forwards, making it extremely risky and difficult to play through that first line of pressure. And on the off chance that the first pass did come through, McAllister and Gravenberch were primed to back up the press, pushing high up onto the pivots. A risk did present itself, with the opposition man potentially getting free behind Liverpool's midfield. But the logic was, if Liverpool's pivots stayed deep, it was much easier for the centre-back to execute a single line break compared to challenging them to complete 2 instead. This was mitigated by Liverpool emphasizing pressing as a unit, so a centre-back was well positioned to jump and join the press on the rare occasions that the double line break occurred. So the main effect of the 4-2-4 shape was that the centre was so well protected that the opposition tended to play wide, which of course became the trigger for the wide pressing trap, as Liverpool would then collapse around the sideline and look to win the ball back. But another differentiating factor between Slot and Klopp was the frequency of the press and the counter-press. The intensity of the Klopp press and counter-press naturally went up and down throughout the years, but for the most part, the intensity was always set to high. When it worked, which was most of the time, it was beautiful chaos, Liverpool swarming the opponent before they even had a chance to breathe. But when it didn't work, it was disjointed, with sporadic pressers looking to apply pressure even when the side was not well positioned to do so. So if one part of the press was bypassed, the shape began to look vulnerable in deeper areas of the pitch. Arne Slot introduced an element of control, with pressing being more strategic. Whenever it was possible and lower risk, Liverpool would still look to swarm the opponent. However, when the press was not on, Liverpool showed a much greater willingness to drop deeper and sit in a more compact shape, usually leaving Salah a little bit higher up alongside the forward, ready to spring forward on the transition. Evolution, not revolution, but perhaps it's actually revolution through evolution.
Whether it's brilliance or vulnerability, one thing's clear: Real Madrid are entering the Champions League with a tactical identity that demands attention. If they get it right, they could dominate Europe once again. If not, well, the cracks might just show. Let me know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tactical deep dives. See you in the next one.